Good morning and welcome to the Point. As the legislature prepares for their lame duck session and a new legislature prepares to be sworn in, there is still some housekeeping to do from Decision 2014. Introducing you to your new legislators, those who will take office in January to represent you in the House and Senate in Lansing. We start with a member you already know. They've served in the House of Representatives as well as in the state Senate, but redistricting means that they were elected to a brand new district during Decision 2014. We start first with newly elected Senator Tanya Schuitmaker. Election night for Republicans turned out to be pretty successful across the state. It didn't necessarily look that way going in. The numbers were kind of all over the board, but they did not seem to be trending for the governor particularly. But in the end, at least as it stands right now, Republicans have big majorities in both the House and Senate. And I say as it stands right now, there's a Senate seat we'll talk about, but let's talk about yours. A sitting senator drawn out of your district into a new district, which includes the home county that you represented for 6 years over in the House. And so it's not like unfamiliar territory, but it does extend all the way up through Allegan County into Kent County, which is new territory for you. Tell me about the election process, meeting new folks, and overall how Republicans did.
Well, I was very excited. You know, the redistricting was fair, constitutional, and it did change my district dramatically. 93% new area, and so it was a lot of new people to get to know. And over the last 3 to 4 years, I've been getting to know those people while also representing the people in Kalamazoo. And they're wonderful people, and I'm very honored to have had their support and have been elected.
You go back into a Senate that is almost unprecedented. I saw one outlet said that perhaps back in the 50s, but no time in recent memory has any party had 27 members. Now, you had 26 in the last 4 years. The upside is you have 26. The downside is you have 26. And as a majority party, it's sometimes hard to keep all those folks together. Now with 27, if in fact you go in with that, what does that do from a governance standpoint? Because not only do you have all of that power, that's a lot of responsibility, because if something gets done or doesn't get done, it's at your feet.
It certainly is, first of all, historic, and second of all, it is a great responsibility. Sometimes if you ask, I think, either Republicans or Democrats, they'll tell you that some of the biggest fights are within the family or within the caucuses. So certainly every member that's elected certainly comes and represents their constituents and has different viewpoints. So 27 is a big number to kind of coalesce behind a thing, but I think it is historic, and I think it's a prime example that for the last 4 years we've been making good decisions for the betterment of the state of Michigan in terms of the jobs and the economy, and that we should keep going in that direction.
So let's go back to that 27 number again. And the reason I wanted to explore this is because I'm not sure people always do the math. But in a chamber where you have 38 members, it takes 19. If you have a tie vote, it would be the lieutenant governor that breaks that tie vote, and in this case, Republicans, so presumably 19 would be enough. But there is something else that is kind of a more inside bowl thing. It's something called immediate effect. And for that, you have to have, what, 26?
26 votes for immediate effect.
So in the past, if you could get everybody on board, which you couldn't always, but if you could get all Republicans on board, you could pass something and get immediate effect, which means it doesn't have to lay over for the 120 days after the beginning of a new session. So it can go into effect right away. Now you actually have one vote to spare. Do you anticipate, and while I understand that the new leaders will talk about reaching across the aisle and getting bipartisan cooperation, when it comes to some of the real heavy lifting, it ends up being a pretty polarized place sometimes. So do you anticipate Republicans doing some arm twisting within that caucus room in the back to get to that 26?
We have always, for the last 4 years, had a caucus rule that said immediate effect was not a substantive vote on the issue, and that it was a caucus rule that you would support the caucus and vote for immediate effect. So the fact that we've added one more seat, I really don't change or see a change in that caucus rule.
As we know them now, 63 members Republican in the House, 27 in the Senate. Republican governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, attorney general, Republican dominated Supreme Court. Republicans control everything in sight in Lansing, and they have for the past 4 years. Over the next at least 2 years, assuming that nothing changes in that next midterm, or in that next election, which will not be a midterm, it'll be a presidential election. But if the control of the House doesn't change for the next 4 years, What do Republicans need to do to make the state of Michigan look like the promise that we hear during election cycles that it holds? Because nobody would argue that Michigan is in a different and I suggest better place than it was 10 years ago, before one of the biggest economic catastrophes that we had ever seen. Regardless of who you want to blame for that, or regardless of who you want to take credit for where we are, this is where we are, but nobody thinks this is where we need to be. So what do Republicans, particularly in the majority, have to do?
Well, certainly Republicans need to continue on the path that we've been doing, which is good governance and sound economic policies. First of all, we've balanced the budget on time. We need to continue on with that. We need to make sure that we have a private sector that is competitive with our other states and other countries, to make sure that we have a great environment that the private sector can grow jobs. Certainly over close to 300,000 jobs have been created because of competitive tax rates, getting rid of burdensome regulations. And so we need to continue on with that. And then also, I think one of the other things that you'll probably start to see is kind of making sure that we break down the silos between K-12, community colleges, higher ed, and vocational technology, and kind of seeing more of a seamless transition so that we can get more people trained in the workforce.
There's a question that you, as with kids who are looking at that college education.
I have one in college.
I, as one that's trying to save for that eventuality. Nobody that looks at the cost of higher education, first of all, to my friends in education, I'm not saying it isn't valuable, but it becomes a real question of diminishing return when you are graduating with a basic 4-year degree with $100 or $75 or maybe $125,000 in debt load. I mean, that's the cost of a new house, or at least it was, at the time we were graduating. What, if anything, can state government do? And I realize there's a federal component to this perhaps, but what can state government do when it comes to those state-funded universities to start to rein in the cost of education at the higher level?
First of all, our Constitution sets up that they're autonomous. So a lot of constituents come to me and say, you got to control them better. And really, the only control that the state legislature, the governor, has is with regards to the purse strings. Roughly, when I went to college, the state funded about 75% of a student's education. Now it's funding about a quarter of that. So it's flip-flopped, and so that's why you have students and families picking up more of that tab. So what we've done is to hopefully incentivize and create more accountability with the institutions, is to put in metrics into the higher ed formula. So we've been going on 4 years now with funding it through metrics, making sure that they get kids through college education timely and quickly, that they are putting more money in the classroom rather than administration, to make sure that they are holding their tuition down and keeping their tuition within the rate of inflation. So we're doing all that in terms of funding with metrics. So if you want this money, then here's what we expect from it. And really, that's really the only control that we have, because they're governed by their own state boards and presidents.
Part of the conversation that you didn't see with Senator Schuitmaker was her prediction that the Senate would deal with some type of road funding very soon in lame duck. She was exactly right about that. In just 2 days before they broke for the Thanksgiving holiday, the Senate passed a wholesale gas tax and sent it over to the House. That may not be the final word in road funding, but the Senate, at least for now, has dealt with it. And there is more to come, just like there's more to the point in just a moment. Welcome back to the Point. We're introducing you to your new legislators, those who were just elected for the first time or elected for the first time to a new district in Decision 2014. That includes the House District number 60. That's where the current representative, Sean McCann, was running for the state Senate. Democrat John Hoadley will replace him in the state House, and here's what he had to say about his new responsibility. Let's start with, first of all, this election cycle. You and I were talking just before we came up here. For you, at least in your particular election, the more competitive races in the primary, and that's not unusual throughout the state. It is the primary where many of these House races are finally settled, because in the general they aren't terribly competitive. But congratulations nonetheless on your general win.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. I really appreciate the voters' trust in me, and hopefully I'll be able to serve the people of Kalamazoo well. And I also think it's about starting a conversation around nonpartisan redistricting. There's so many of these non-competitive or less competitive districts across the state. And I think we do best as a state when we actually are having a competitive election where there's a healthy exchange of ideas. So I was really glad to win my general election, and would also love to continue that work of nonpartisan redistricting.
I want to talk about nonpartisan redistricting because as a reporter, as somebody who's observed this for a long time, it's an interesting question, but I want to go back to the election for just a little bit, because we were also talking about the fact, as I've talked with others, that this was a process where the numbers were close, the electorate was closely divided, and that on election night we might have seen this go either way. And when I say this, I'm talking about the governor's race, because it was very close, or appeared to be. Ended up being very close, as a matter of fact. But in that process, after more than a year and a half of campaigning, after tens of millions of dollars were spent, the control of power the day before the election and the day after the election are almost identical. If anything, Republicans increased their margins marginally. What does that say for you as a freshman incoming into the minority party, observing as you have for the past 4 years?
Well, I think there were great candidates this year. I'm thinking about some of those Democratic candidates that were really working hard and talking to voters. The problem, though, was turnout. When we talk about control of power, we also have to remember that for some reason 88,000 fewer people showed up to vote this year than voted in 2010. And so, when I'm looking at where does this mean for Michigan, what do we need to do moving forward? I think it means that all of us on both sides of the aisle need to be having a real wake-up call about, are we talking about the things that really connect with voters? Are we being able to address the everyday issues that people are facing and motivate them to then come in and weigh in on their government?
What makes a guy like you want to get into this fray? Because I know you've been very active in a lot of roles in the past, but in the state legislature, it is, and people sometimes kind of look at me funny when I say this. They say, well, they only meet for so many days. This is about a 20-hour-a-day job if you do it right, because your phone never quits ringing. There's never a day you don't have an invitation to show up to 14 events. You can only make it to half of them. I mean, this is a really time-consuming and sometimes pressure-packed job. What makes you want to do that?
I think most of us want to get into public service because we believe in public service. When I started running, I talked about a Michigan that invests in people. I think for a lot of folks in my generation, we've seen a disinvestment. It's the cost of going to college is going up, and we're seeing less state support. The cost of buying your first home becomes harder. The cost of having your first child is becoming less and less accessible. So these sort of hallmarks of the American dream are starting to get out of reach for a lot of folks in my generation. I think one of the biggest stories that we haven't talked a lot about yet coming out of the 2014 elections was that the number of representatives and senators in the legislature under the age of 35 went from 12 to 21. So I think there is a real stepping up of the millennial generation that's saying, regardless of what side of the aisle you're on, we've got some big issues that we've got to tackle together for Michigan if we want to make it the place that can attract the best talent, have families want to start their homes and their businesses here. And that's going to require people working together.
One of the things, and I find that very interesting, because one of the things that the promise of term limits was supposed to bring, pardon me, was that you would be able to bring more young people into public service because they could do it at the beginning of a career or at a juncture in their career where they could get away. It wasn't something that would go on forever. Do you think that plays into any of this, in addition to the fact that younger people want to get involved?
I don't think term limits is the reason that more young people are running. I think it's interesting that folks like, Senator Richardville are having a conversation about easing term limits now, because I think by and large that we've seen when we have very short term limits coupled with high campaign finance in gerrymandered districts, it's really a recipe for bad government. And so, I think young people are stepping up because we want to see change. And we might not agree exactly on what that policy change needs to look like, but I think we're all in agreement that the things that we're doing right now aren't getting us to where we need to go. And if we want to have a 21st century economy with a 21st century educated workforce, that's going to mean reinvesting in people in our communities.
I won't make you speak for your 20 colleagues that are around your same age, but when you think about change that needs to happen here, you've already mentioned the high cost of higher education, which so many of us struggle with, and it makes it unattainable for some. It makes it so expensive for others that when they get out of school, they've got a burden that really makes their career less valuable because they spend all that time paying back that. But beyond that, what is the change you would like to affect?
So, I've talked a lot about education. I released a 5-point education plan that I've been talking about for, over a year now. And I'm just really excited about it because there's pieces on there that I think reach across the aisle. Whether we're at the center of it, though, is about early childhood education, really strengthening public education, and then finding ways to make higher education accessible to everybody. We don't need everybody going to college because that's not right for every person. But we also need trained technicians, skilled labor folks who, need some additional certification or apprentice program. All of these things should be available to us. And so when I think about change that we should see in Michigan, we've got to go back to the days when higher education was much more affordable, especially if we're seeing folks who are getting into their first jobs with lower pay and lower benefits. That's the wrong direction.
Now, I want to bring this up to you, and I do this only because as I was listening to you, it dawned on me, when you talk about higher education expense, that's something that Governor Rick Snyder has talked about. When you talk about accessibility to trained skilled trades, that's something that Governor Rick Snyder has talked about. And when you talk about early childhood development, that's something that this governor has already invested more money in with the help of the legislature. Have you had the opportunity yet to talk to Governor Snyder about any of these things? Because at least in those three areas, it would appear that the two of you might be very much in sync.
I would welcome the conversation with Governor Snyder. And like I said, these good ideas don't have an R or a D after their name. Good ideas are good ideas. The question is making sure that we're balancing these good ideas with their overall priorities for the budget and for the state, and making sure that, like, for example, when we're increasing access to early childhood education, we're not doing it at the expense of K-12 education, the school aid fund, or then tapping into the school aid fund to pay for community college and other higher education expenses. This is really about, do we actually make more pie instead of just cutting the pie differently? And I hope that I could have a very productive conversation with Governor Snyder, because I know so many people want to see real movement on these issues, in addition to road funding and making sure that we protect everybody from discrimination in Michigan.
I'm not sure when this airs, but you may get a pass on road funding. That may all be taken care of lame duck, and by the time this airs, that may have been taken care of. But let's talk about this. When you talk about education, you're an education guy. First time I talked with you, you talked about your 5-point plan. When I heard you speak down at WMU, when you were down there with a number of Democratic candidates late in the general, you were talking about education and the importance of it. Give me your take on Common Core, because I have recently been reviewing some of the workbooks and some of the things that we've seen on Common Core. There is so much information, some of it is disinformation about Common Core that is out there. What's your take as a guy who is very interested if we assume that Common Core remains the policy of the state of Michigan?
So Common Core started as a bipartisan idea, which means there's a couple of conflicting thoughts to get to the policy that is Common Core. When I think about some of the good things in Common Core, to me that means moving away from a trivia-based curriculum and really more into a problem-solving and logic-based curriculum. Anyone can go Google what the state capitol is now, but the question is, how do you develop the thinking and critical analysis skills that we need to really solve problems in the 21st century. So I appreciate those aspects of it. I also do appreciate the fact that this came from the Governors Association when they were trying to say, hey, could we have a little bit more of uniformity between states? So if a student, because of our current economy, moves from one state to another, that they don't lose years in school doing that. But that said, there's also concerns. The piece around testing and evaluation needs to be seriously thought about. Some of the ideas of value-added evaluation to see how much value teachers were adding into the curriculum, adding to the classroom, those, what seemed initially promising has come under scrutiny now and saying that maybe those evaluation standards are flawed. Additionally, anytime that we're making the sole responsibility of a child's outcome hang on the teachers' heads as opposed to the parents and the community and the students themselves, I think that's missing part of the conversation. I come from a family of teachers, so I've seen this on all sides of the debate. But that said, at the end of the day, I do think there's some value here in Common Core. There's still work to do to hammer out the details, but we have to try different things if we want to see different results.
We're going to have you back and talk about a lot of different subjects over the course of the next couple of years and perhaps beyond. But I want to get back to something we talked about that you brought up early on, and that is nonpartisan redistricting. Briefly, the fellow who held the seat before you did, Sean McCann, talked about this as well. The idea being that you get together, and it can have any number of different variations, but a group of people who identify themselves with R's, a group that identify with the D's, perhaps people who call themselves independents, whatever the makeup of that is, and then start looking at drawing the district boundaries for House seats and for Senate seats using common geographic borders, not cutting through municipalities where, if you don't have to, understanding that there are federal election rules that suggest that you're going to have some districts drawn in a more specific way. Realistically, how hard is it to get there?
I think it's going to require a ballot proposal to get there. There is a disincentive for legislators who's favored in the current maps to vote against those. I wish that wasn't the case, but and I'm not calling any one legislator out, but I think that's inherent and unfortunately in some of the human nature here. So by moving to a ballot proposal, I do think we could have an intelligent conversation with voters. I mean, at the end of the day, our democracy is based on the idea that voters pick their representatives, not the other way around. So when we see partisan gerrymanders happening where legislators are diving deep into the data to figure out exactly who are the most likely voters to vote for them and then draw the lines using supercomputers to find the optimal outcome of that, that's not what anybody intended. It doesn't listen to the needs of our communities, and it makes these non-competitive districts that then has all the action focusing on a handful of districts to decide ultimately some major decisions about the direction Michigan moves. I mean, we really could, using a nonpartisan system, say, what are some criteria that we want? Do we want more competitive districts where, do we want geographic districts that are clustering more of our communities of interest? And do we want to make sure that some of the folks involved in that are skilled in map making and some of the other ramifications?
Or demographics or any of those things that might figure into it. We're about out of time, but I've got to ask you this. You singled out legislators, which may well be true, but don't you think both Republicans and Democrats have pressure from their parties that may not want to change this? Because if you're in charge, you get to draw those lines. If you're not in charge, you hope to be in charge to draw those lines every 10 years, and the parties may have a vested interest in trying to keep them that way too, right?
I think so. And let's talk about the political parties. Let's talk about the lobbyists who have more seniority than almost any legislator there. Let's talk about the fact that big money is the ones who want the fewest number of non-competitive districts so they don't have to write checks everywhere. They can just write checks in a few places. And I think that's wrong. I think Michigan's fed up with that. And so I would love to see us have a conversation over the next few years about this sort of trio of things that lead to a less functional government. These idea of very short-term limits that give lobbyists more power. These idea that we have legislators drawing districts and voters instead of the other way around. That we have very high campaign finance limits where people are writing $6,800 checks and $68,000 checks. That's not what anyone intended when they said we should set up a democracy. So let's turn it around. We can do that if we all work together and have an adult conversation.
Those are just two of about a dozen new legislators from our viewing area, and over the next several weeks, we'll bring you our conversation with others. And we'll be back with more To the Point in just a moment. With Decision 2014 in the books, the balance of power in Lansing really hasn't changed that much. Republicans still control the office of governor, the state senate, and the state house. So over the next 2 to 4 years, we'll see exactly how they try to govern in the state, and we'll talk about it every Sunday right here, To the Point.